Good morning, class, and welcome to the March 6th lecture for History 1681. Our topic today is the spread of Buddhism outside India and also the rise of the Tang Dynasty in China. Before we get to that, though, just in case you forgot or didn't know, your paper on the Chinese maize murders is due March 29th. The assignment is in the syllabus, and you can expect to see this warning every class session until the paper is actually due. Okay, a little roadmap to today's topic. We'll start with Buddhism, which we last left when it was still in India, where it started. So changes to Buddhism, the two major branches of Buddhism that developed, and then it spread outside of India to these four key places. On Thursday, we'll be looking at its spread from China into Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. But today we're focusing on its immediate spread straight from India into these regions. And then a not unrelated topic, the Tang Dynasty, which, at least in its early stages, heavily promoted Buddhism in China. So we start with Buddhism in India in the centuries after Buddha's death, or if you're a Buddhist, after he achieved nirvana in 483 BCE. He lived and died in India, well, Nepal and India, let's say. So his entire career was on the Indian subcontinent. We've already seen some of the changes that occurred to this belief system in the centuries after his death, which he really didn't intend, but belief systems have a way of developing in this fashion. First of all, it seems fairly common to belief systems of all kinds to want or need some kind of deity-like figure. And so in Buddhism, although the Buddha himself thought of himself as a guide to enlightenment, not a god, in the centuries following his death, Buddhism actually adopted him as a kind of god equivalent. He's still a guide to enlightenment, but he's considered a divine or quasi-divine guide to enlightenment. In this context, nirvana, the union with the universal void that you already know about, becomes a kind of alternative to salvation, or becomes equivalent to salvation. So what does the ordinary population do, the lay population, that is people who are not actual monks, nuns, priests? They support the monks and nuns, and there do come to be monks and nuns in the centuries after Buddha's death, although he might not have been able to foresee it. They make charitable donations. You acquire merit in the Buddhist scheme of things by making this kind of donation to monks and nuns who live in monasteries, don't really have real-world occupations, but are mainly involved in meditating and doing good works. So that's one change, the whole monastery infrastructure and the activity of the lay population in giving donations. A second one, there comes to be a kind of cult of relics. And here I'll throw a question out to today's small graduate student audience. What do you think of when you think of a relic? And don't say me.
Body parts of saintly people?
Yes, like it gets kind of grisly sometimes with body parts left behind by these sacred people. In the Buddhist case, you don't get quite the level of relicism that you will see later in medieval Christianity, but things like a lock of his hair, a tooth, purported to be his body parts. After he achieved nirvana, his body was actually apparently divided up for relics. And of course, centuries later, a tooth or a lock of hair or a footprint will appear, and it might be Buddha's and it might not be. These come to be housed in shrines all over the world, anywhere there are Buddhists. And this kind of a shrine is known as a stupa. This is actually the first Buddhist devotional structure, we could say. So you can see from these three examples from all different periods, they're fairly simple, just basically mounds, like earthen mounds covered with stone. I don't think the screen is taking the laser point, but in any case. This particular one here on the left is one of the first ever constructed. It was actually constructed by Ashoka, the third emperor of the Malaria Dynasty, who very famously converted to Buddhism after a very violent battle. And he constructed this stupa in north-central India. This much later one is in Nepal, and finally this much later one in Indonesia. You'll notice the Indonesian one you look closely, it looks kind of like an Aztec pyramid. It's actually covered with small statues of Buddha himself. But in the earlier ones, there are no figures of Buddha at all. That was not yet a thing. In Ashoka's time, and for centuries thereafter, you don't see figurative images of the Buddha. In a few slides you'll see when they start to come in. So these relics are like buried somewhere in this stupa. And the stupa could also contain the ashes of Buddhist leaders who were cremated. What you start to see as the centuries go by, in addition, is cults not only of relics, but kind of devotional cults. They're called bhakti cults, and bhakti is simply a Sanskrit word meaning devotion. The same kinds of cults existed in Hinduism. So it's just kind of a gathering of followers of the Buddha who have a kind of organized set of activities. They fast, they meditate, they do certain spiritual exercises. So we could see what we're seeing in total is the process of Buddhism becoming an organized religion and not just a personal path to enlightenment. And this is while it's still based in India. Again, as the centuries go by, Buddhism in and outside of India divides into two branches. And this is not an official schism, not like what you see in Christianity, for example, what you will see in a few weeks, but just a kind of gradual shaping of two different traditions, two different approaches to this belief system. The earlier one, they're both still around today, by the way, but the earlier one is known as Theravada, literally means teaching of the elder. It used to be called Hinayana, lesser vehicle, but that's considered a disparaging name, so that term is no longer used. And essentially, this is closer to what we think Buddha himself did. It's focused on individual meditation with the ultimate goal, which very few people actually achieve, of nirvana. The more widespread branch is Mahayana, or great vehicle. There's that Maha prefix. As Sanskrit is Indo-European, Maha is related to major, mayor, etc. So great vehicle. And it seems to have started in India, just like Theravada, but long after Ashoka's death, so 1st century BCE, maybe 1st century CE, and it becomes really, really widespread about a half millennium later, about 500 years later. How does it differ from Theravada? Well, instead of stressing the individual's quest for enlightenment, it really stresses Buddhism as a group devotional exercise. Your personal devotion to Buddha, and it's not so much you're meditating to try and achieve union with the void, but you see Buddha as really that divine guide to enlightenment. He becomes a sort of savior figure in this context. And if you're particularly devoted, like if you practice bhakti enough, he will reward you with entrance to paradise, which is synonymous with nirvana in this case. So Buddha as savior, nirvana as paradise. This thinking, this approach, the Mahayana approach, introduces gradually a kind of spiritual hierarchy. You have Buddha himself, the great enlightened one, a kind of God equivalent, and then below him you have a category of beings known as bodhisattvas, enlightened ones. And what they are is kind of extremely enlightened people who are so enlightened that they actually could achieve nirvana if they wanted to, but they put it off deliberately so that they can help other people, you know, the rest of us poor slobs who are not so enlightened, achieve it. So you have a series of bodhisattvas, you know, who originally were ordinary mortals, embodying different qualities. One of the more popular is the Maitreya, the Bodhisattva of Compassion. You could say they're kind of like demigods. I don't think many Buddhists would agree with you if you said that, but it's kind of, they're next on the spiritual hierarchy before full enlightenment and nirvana. And notice that here, these statues are both from a Buddhist kingdom in Afghanistan in the 3rd century Common Era. So we're starting to see, it is this kingdom, in fact, that introduces figurative images of the Buddha. So here he is, well, on top, Buddha achieving nirvana, and then on the bottom, the Bodhisattva of Compassion. We'll get back to that kingdom in just a minute. So let's turn to the spread of both these branches of Buddhism. the spread starts under Ashoka himself, the great Maurya emperor, third emperor, who because of this horrific battle at Kalinga, which he wins, but which has 100,000 casualties, is so horrified that he converts from Hinduism to Buddhism. He's played by the great Shah Rukh Khan in the Bollywood epic. And just an aside, I actually attempted to watch this film the other day. It is really Bollywood. There's singing and dancing and a love interest that didn't really exist. So it's fun, but you know, what the real Ashoka would have thought of it, we cannot know. In any case, the real Ashoka, as you know, wanted to spread Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism is a pacifist religion, which was the reason he converted to it, so you don't force people. Instead, he put up rock edicts, Sanskrit carved on the rock throughout his vast kingdom, all of India, what are today Afghanistan, Pakistan, much of Nepal, and Bangladesh. And he also sent out missionaries to spread the word. This was the Theravada style of Buddhism, so far as we know, based on personal meditation. His big success story during his reign was spreading it to Sri Lanka, the island off the coast of India, where even to this day it is the majority religion. Sri Lanka's recently ended, very violent, decades-long civil war actually pitted the majority Buddhist population against the Tamil Hindu minority. And then later, centuries after Ashoka's death, Theravada Buddhism spreads from Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, and then separately to Indonesia. And I mentioned Malaysia, I said Indonesia, Malaysia, and also to an extent Indonesia as well. Now as for Mahayana, it tends to spread up in the north. Long after Ashoka is dead, Mahayana Buddhism didn't really exist as a branch of Buddhism during his lifetime. So it spreads in the early centuries of the Common Era, northwest to Afghanistan and northeast to China and also to Tibet. And then as you see, it spreads from China to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, which we will be seeing on Thursday. Now what about in India itself? One of the great ironies of history is that over the centuries, Buddhism actually loses its influence entirely in India. You know, by maybe 1500, by the early modern era, there are basically no Buddhists left in India. They aren't wiped out militarily or anything. It's a gradual process that's still not completely understood. It has something to do with demographics, strong Hindu kingdoms like the Gupta that sponsor Hinduism, the coming in of various Muslim polities, and a lack of state sponsorship for Buddhism in general. So it's one of the few world religions, maybe the only one, that really does not exist anymore in the place where it originated. Today, really the only Buddhists in India are followers of the Dalai Lama, who will be appearing in a few slides. Okay, here we're getting back to this kingdom in what's now Afghanistan, which I wanted to mention because of its importance as a Buddhist kingdom and also artistically and commercially. This is a kingdom known as the Kushan Empire. It's kind of a mini empire, and if you remember the Gupta Empire, the Hindu empire, decentralized Hindu empire in the early centuries of the Common Era, and if you remember, it's much smaller than the Maurya Empire and much more decentralized. The darker blue areas are tributary states, not under direct Gupta rule, but they send tribute, they don't rebel, and then up to the north of that, you have this little beige patch labeled Kushan Empire, and that's what we're talking about. The Kushans were an Indo-European people, maybe Iranic or Iranian, related to the Iranians, we're not sure, maybe not, but speaking an Indo-European language. And like the Parthians up in northeastern Iran, they were heavily Hellenized, thanks to the much earlier invasion by Alexander the Great and the post-Alexander rule of the area by his generals. So like the Parthians, their coinage, which you see over on the left, you see what alphabet the inscription is written in?
Blurry, but is it Greek?
It is Greek, yes, Greek alphabet. And in fact, that seems to say Buddha over on the left. So Buddha is on the one side of the coin, and on the other is a Kushan ruler. So the same way well, the Parthians were not Buddhist, but they had their ruler on one side, and I honestly don't remember what they had on the reverse. It was not Zoroastrian priests in any case. So the Kushans are situated right along the Silk Road, and they're extremely important, like the Parthians, in trade through the region, from China out to the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire, and trade into India. And because they're so heavily Hellenized, when they introduce figurative images of the Buddha, these are very kind of Greco-Roman-like figures. So they're statues of the Bodhisattva of Compassion, of Buddha himself, and maybe above all, this kind of bas relief of the Buddha achieving nirvana. That could be the death of Socrates. You know, if you didn't know any better, you'd think, oh, it's some Greek sculpture, but it is actually from the Kushan kingdom in what's now Afghanistan in the early centuries of the Common Era. So they are the first political entity to introduce figures, human figures of the Buddha. There, by the way, is Sanchi, where Ashoka's great stupa was located. I also have Bamyan on this map. It is today in kind of north-central Afghanistan. After the Kushans were already gone, after their empire was gone, there were still Buddhist statelets in the region, and one of them built these gigantic Buddhas that they put in 2 niches. There were 2 of them, and they looked out over this valley. Well, unfortunately, this is an example of the negative interaction of modernity and antiquity. The Taliban, the Islamist militants in Afghanistan, decided to make a statement by blowing up the Buddhas with dynamite in early 2001. And their reason for doing that was that they claimed that people were worshiping these Buddha statues as idols. It did not help that the population of Bamyan was largely Shiite. The Taliban are militant Sunnis, and at the time they were very vehemently hostile toward the Shiites. What the people who lived in Bamyan said was, we know they're not gods, and we're not Buddhists, we're Muslims, but we consider them part of our national heritage, and we think of them as kind of good luck charms, like guarding the valley. Well, they may have been lucky for the population, but they didn't have much luck themselves. And the Afghan government swore that they would rebuild them, but hasn't been able to acquire the resources and the organization to do it. A more pleasant cross-cultural moment, or not, maybe. Descendants of Buddhist priests, maybe even Buddhist priests in the service of the Kushan Empire, but from Afghanistan, migrated to what is now Iraq, and their descendants converted to Islam, served as government ministers to the Abbasid caliphs, whom you heard about last week. The famous Barmakid family of Grand Viziers. They're called Barmakid because it's from Paramaka, which is a word for a Buddhist priest. So the ancestors of these Abbasid ministers were Buddhist priests. It's a real cross-cultural moment there, from what's now Afghanistan to what's now Iraq. Because of trade, we don't really know why they moved, but it kind of underlines the point that these various empires and states are completely connected. They border each other, they know what each other is doing, they trade, they fight, etc. It's a very far cry from a couple of thousand years earlier, when there were vast distances in between political entities. Okay, now finally we're getting to China. It's Mahayana Buddhism that spreads to China, not Theravada. And it starts to spread fairly early on. It's already around in the later years of the Han Dynasty, but the Han themselves, the actual dynasty, does not officially adopt it. It spreads from India and also from Afghanistan. I mean, the Kushans may have had some role in it in the 1st century of the Common Era, but it only becomes really entrenched in China after the Han have fallen in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And it's remarkable in that it's really the only time before the 19th century, CE, that is the era of European colonialism and imperialism, that China has imported a major cultural idea from abroad. And Judge Dee actually refers to this, not in the book you're reading, but in one of the other novels. He makes kind of disparaging remarks about Buddhism being a foreign import. Buddhism can easily coexist with Confucianism, and it does to some extent under the Tang Dynasty. Confucianism, as you well know, is not a religion, it's an ethical system, so you can be a good Confucian and still, for your spiritual needs, turn to Buddhism. Like Taoism, which is indigenous to China, it offers a spiritual element that Confucianism does not have. You know, Confucianism is about ordering the family and society. It's not really about enlightenment and the spiritual element. So once it takes root after the Han fall, during a period of about 400 years, one of those chaotic periods when there are a bunch of little kingdoms and statelets but no real unifying empire, in that context, there is a burst of religious scholarship having to do with how Buddhism takes root in China, because Chinese Buddhists want to be able to read the Buddhist scriptures, the sutras, in Chinese. So you have the phenomenon of Buddhist monks from China traveling to India, which was not easy, to collect these scriptures and bring them back for translation. I'll mention the two most famous, first of all, and I'm sure I'm going to slaughter their names, so bear with me. Faxian, in the early 5th century. So where China and India are concerned, this is after the Han, it's during the Gupta Empire in India. You can see how this is not very wonderful map, his outbound trip, the red line, from Chang'an, the old Han capital, is overland. He gets to India. He's mainly in kind of Nepal and far northern India and along the eastern coast, but then he comes back by sea, which makes sense in a Gupta context. If you remember, the Gupta really promoted the sea lanes. A few centuries later, about 200 years later, a different monk, and I'm going to try hard, I looked up how to pronounce his name, Zhangzang, traveled to India himself, and you can see from this lower map, his route was entirely by land. It's at the height of the Tang Dynasty, or not really the height, but when the Tang Dynasty is beginning, and his visit is official. It is sponsored by the Tang Emperor. When he gets to India, though, the Gupta are no more, so you have a bunch of little Hindu and Buddhist statelets. Unlike Faxian, he goes all over India, and he comes back by land. When he comes back to Chang'an with all these Buddhist scriptures, on elephant back and camel back, there's a wild celebration. And in fact, in the city of Xi'an, which is more or less on the site of the old Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty built a huge pagoda, and these are my photos, to commemorate his return with these scriptures and the translation of the scriptures. And there's a statue of what Zhangzang may or may not have looked like. The pagoda is called some variation on Wild Goose Pagoda, not because they thought that this monk was like a wild goose, but he was in that he returned, because wild geese return. We can see that in Columbus even now. If you've been hearing honking, that's why. And I would have put up the picture with history graduate student Fred Sean standing in front of the pagoda smiling goofily, but I thought I would spare him that public humiliation. So this is a watershed for Buddhism in China, because it means that the scriptures are accessible to Buddhist monks and to the literate part of the lay population. To put this in a broader ideological context in this kind of 300 years of post-Han China, of course, Buddhism is not the only ideology in China. Confucianism, this ethical system that doesn't really compete one-on-one with Buddhism or Taoism because it's not a religion, but they do tend to exist in a kind of tension with each other. In times of turmoil like this, where you don't have a strong empire, in very general terms, Confucianism tends to decline. I guess you could say, well, it's normal. People are looking for stability in a time of chaos. They want some kind of spiritual guarantee. Ironically, though, Confucius himself lived in a time of chaos like this one. Mahayana Buddhism is very successful in China. It takes root both among the settled population and even the nomads, like even the Turkic tribes up in the north, including the Uyghurs. Part of the reason it's so successful, and the thing about Mahayana, one of the things that differentiates it from Theravada, because it contains this divinity idea and the Bodhisattva idea, it can, at least in theory, kind of sort of incorporate pre-existing indigenous deities. This doesn't mean that like every, native Uyghur demigod is suddenly turned into a bodhisattva. It's not as simple as that, but the potential is there. And any time a religion has that quality where it can kind of mesh with pre-existing beliefs, it's going to spread more easily because conversion is a more seamless transition. What about Taoism, the ancient indigenous Chinese nature religion in this context? Taoism retains its appeal to peasants, maybe because it focuses on the way, the Tao in nature. It has sort of an innate appeal to peasants. You may or may not recall that the Han Dynasty itself was severely weakened by peasant rebellions in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, Buddhism is an urban religion, Taoism is a rural religion, but all other things being equal, Taoism tends to retain its appeal to the peasants. And it can also be used as a kind of ideological leverage by regional rulers in a time where there is no strong centralized empire. So some regional rulers embrace Taoism, however sincerely, they can still use it as a form of political leverage for their own legitimacy, and some of them actually persecute Buddhists, not necessarily out of any hatred for Buddhism per se, but in order to gain political leverage and show that they're the boss and they're the ones with legitimacy. You remember Lao Tzu, the reputed founder of Taoism in remote antiquity, always pictured riding his ox, and there's some spectacular Taoist monasteries, including this one. I think it's the most famous. If you Google Taoist monastery, you'll get this, in the Wudong Mountains. It's sort of in central to eastern China. There they are on the map. So pulling back from China a little bit, most people know a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism, and if they know nothing else, they know who the Dalai Lama is. So how did Tibet become Buddhist? Buddhism spread northward. You can see what was the Tibetan Empire between the 7th and 9th century CE is pretty much directly north of India. So it spread, Mahayana Buddhism spread directly from India into Tibet after it spread to China, so about the 7th century CE. So around the time that Islam was emerging in the Arabian Peninsula, Buddhism is spreading into Tibet. And what makes it take hold so effectively in Tibet is this reason I was just mentioning. It meshes very well with indigenous traditions. So Tibetan Buddhism is quite distinctive. It's not just the Dalai Lama, but other aspects of it as well. But I did want to mention the Dalai Lama because he's a famous, world dignitary, now living in exile in India. His name, his title, Dalai Lama. Lama is a Tibetan word that's roughly equivalent to guru in Sanskrit, so like a teacher, a spiritual guide. The Dalai part of it, that's quite interesting. It is a Mongol word. That is the Mongol attempt to translate the Tibetan word gyatso, which literally means ocean, but that is the family name of the Dalai Lama. Okay, got all that? And you might think, am I reading this number correctly? Is he only the 14th Dalai Lama? How far back does the line go? It actually goes back to 1391 CE, so you think, wow, they must have lived a really long time. The reason there have been only 14 has to do with the nature of Tibetan Buddhism and this incorporation of indigenous beliefs. Part of their belief system is reincarnation, and the idea is the great soul of these lamas, and the Dalai Lama is only one of a number, is reincarnated, and they kind of have to look for the next one. It might be in the body of a child or something like that. So it's something that other forms of Buddhism might not recognize, but it has amazing staying power in Tibetan Buddhism. And most Buddhists in India today are followers of the Dalai Lama, whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents migrated from China in the 1950s. Okay, a little bit farther north in Central Asia. The Uyghurs are a very important element in the Judge D mystery that you're reading. Here they are in relation to the Tang Empire. You can see the Tang over in the east, and the Uyghur Khaganate, their kingdom, their mini empire, it's actually not that mini, it's pretty big, is up to the north and out to the west. They are a Turkic people, and Buddhism spreads to their territory as well, up from Tibet, so a little bit later. In the 8th and 9th centuries, they convert to Buddhism. They kind of try on a bunch of different religions after Buddhism, believe it or not. They give the Manichaean heresy of Zoroastrianism a shot, and then Nestorian Christianity, and then today most of them are Muslim. So it kind of, the fact that they're right on the Silk Road, they have commercial interactions with all these different religions has a lot to do with that. In the 8th and 9th century, when their empire was at its height, so they're contemporary with the Abbasid Caliphate out to the west, they patronized Buddhism very heavily. And some of their artists did remarkable wall paintings in these caves right on the northwestern border with the Tang Dynasty, right around the area where the Chinese maze murders is supposedly set. So one of the images is of a Buddhist ascetic. And when I say ascetic, what do I mean? Someone who's ascetic?
Removed from everyday life?
Okay, removed from everyday life. Can it be a...
Someone who practices sort of extreme denialism?
Right. Self-denial and removal from everyday life, like this monk here. He's got his man bun, his devotional beads, and he's not wearing very much, maybe skins, and his chest is bare. You can't see him that well because the painting's faded, but he's someone who kind of wanders around and fasts a lot and spends most of his time meditating. The Uyghur capital, which is now a complete ruin, was Kara-Balgasun up in the north. So Buddhism was quite widespread in the 8th and 9th centuries, maybe 7th to 10th centuries, or even 7th to 12th or 13th, in this entire area. Even the early Mongols, who come exploding out of what's now Mongolia in the late 12th century, the early Mongols were Buddhists. How early, you ask? Well, here's an early Mongol right here. She can only be 2 or 3 years old. I love this photo. What she seems to be doing is imitating the camel. Okay, so the Tang Empire, you might wonder how am I going to find a transition to this. Buddhism spreads to China at a time when there is no centralized empire. The first centralized empire to adopt it and really promote it is the Tang Empire. So we're going to step back a little bit, look at the rise of the Tang, and then look at how they deal with Buddhism. Couple of general patterns with the onset of the Middle Ages, and that's kind of a loose globalizing use of Middle Ages to mean everything from about 500 CE to maybe 12 or 1300 CE. But during this period, at the beginning of which the Tang rise, China re-centralizes. So it's pulling out of this post-Tang decentralization. And ideologically, it sort of retrenches. And usually what that means in a Chinese context is a reinforcement of Confucianism. In the Tang case, though, you're going to see a reinforcement of Confucianism and, at the same time, patronizing Buddhism, at least in the early years. To put it in a global context, you can contrast the Tang centralization with the Abbasids, their neighbors and sometime enemies, which, as you saw on Thursday, was decentralized pretty much right from the outset with lots of autonomous regional governors, and also to the Roman Empire. By this time, by the time the Tang arise, we're heavily into the Byzantine period, and the western half it's been invaded by Germanic tribes. It's totally fragmented into these little kingdoms, bringing on the so-called Dark Ages. I have them in quotation marks because the more research is done, the less dark they seem, in Western Europe. So that's what's going on when the Tang arise. Okay, so going back to the Han, how do the Tang come out of the wreck left behind by the Han? Well, I'm over-dramatizing it. We've already seen the Han are weakened by these Taoist-inspired peasant rebellions. The peasant rebellions don't bring an end to them, but they weaken the central state. Civil war further weakens it, and it finally falls. The dynasty finally falls in a military coup. That's kind of a little twist on the old Chinese pattern. You know, if we go all the way back to 700 BCE, what typically happened was that nomadic or semi-nomadic populations from the northern border area would invade. Now, though, the typical pattern is some kind of military coup. So what it shows is the incorporation of more territory by all of these Chinese empires and the greater integration of the peoples around them. But once this military coup happens, the typical pattern resumes. You have a kind of relatively chaotic period when regional warlords take over and found small states. Some of these states are actually very important, and they are commercially and artistically quite vibrant, particularly in this Yellow River region where the Han themselves were based. Finally, in the late 6th century, so a relatively short period of chaos, you know, only about 350 years, it's kind of like a replay of Qin Shi Huangdi and his son. You have a two-man dynasty that kind of intervenes between two much longer reigning centralized dynasties. This is the Sway Dynasty, consisting of two people, and the first one was Wendi, not Wendy, not who's walking down the street. No, not a Wendi, who started out as an official in one of these northern Chinese statelets, and then kind of took power into his own hands and carved out an empire not as big as the Han, but approaching it, and brought a kind of centralizing stability in the late 6th century. He dies in 604, and he's succeeded by his son, Yongdi, kind of like Qin Shi Huangdi's son. The son kind of blows it all. In this case, it's not because he's autocratic and authoritarian, although he may have been, but he had expansionist designs at the same time that he was facing invasion. So from the north, he's facing invasion by this Turkic empire, not the Uyghurs, but a different Turkic empire, the Gökturks. So while trying to deal with that, he wants to conquer Korea directly. You'll see on Thursday, Korea was a tributary of Tong China, but he wants the direct control, and so he tries to conquer it, I believe, overland. So he's overextended, underdefended, and that pretty much leads to the failure of his state. And it collapses in 615, and he is later executed. Nonetheless, the Sui kind of set the stage for the Tang, and it's that new old pattern again. The founder of the Tang dynasty was an official in Yongdi's state. So he's kind of like Wendi. He's an official in the previous government. He realizes that Yongdi is kind of a disaster, so he rebels against him and founds his own dynasty. He is the Duke of Tang. That's the regnal name, kind of the name the dynasty takes when it's ruling. The family name is Li, fairly common Chinese and also Korean surname. He himself reigns for 8 years and then is deposed by his own son, Li Shimin, who is considered one of the greatest early Tang emperors, and you see a much later picture of him there. My rather bad pun for remembering the Tang Empire and its geographical extent, if you compare it to the Han, you can see that the Tang have this long tongue of land stretching out into Central Asia. That is no accident. They were of partial Central Asian Turkic descent themselves, in addition to Han Chinese, and they were very, very, very interested in the Silk Road trade. Trade. Today in China, the Tang are sort of celebrated. The prosperous Tang dynasty, you hear a lot about that, for their commercial prosperity and their promotion of this long-distance trade. Any museum, any art museum worth its salt is going to have at least one of these famous ceramic Tang dynasty camels, or horses, or pictures of semi-nomadic tribesmen who raised the camels and the horses and were middlemen on the trade. By the way, I have to give a shout out to Richard Bullitt, one of the world's leading camel experts. These are two-humped camels. The one-humped kind are more in the Middle East, the two-humped kind are sort of east of Iran into Central Asia and, yes, China. And you don't really ride the two-humped ones so much, but they're excellent pack animals. And they're furrier than the one-humped kind, so they can withstand a cold winter as well. in their own heartland, the Tang managed to unify the two great river valleys the way no empire had managed to do before. The Yellow up in the north and the Yangtze farther south. Other empires, including the Han, had ruled both of them, but there's a really full integration of both rivers so that you can have trade fairly easily from one region to another. And it's actually a much larger region than it looks like on the map, under the Tang. One big advantage of this is that down in the south, in the Yangtze Valley, it's rice growing territory. The Yellow River Valley, you can grow rice there now, certainly, but this is kind of wheat, dumpling and noodle territory. Wheat and millet are the big grain crops. Rice is not a native crop. The Yangtze Valley, that region is much warmer and wetter, so it's much better for growing rice. And the great thing about rice is that compared to most other grains, wheat, corn or maize, barley, even millet, it provides more calories per acre under cultivation. So that's going to mean the Tang can support that much larger of a population if they can transport the rice when necessary from one river to another. So they're concentrating more of their resources on the Yangtze Valley. Their headquarters is still up in the Yellow River Valley region, but the Yangtze is a more important part of Chinese empires from the Tang on. It's more stable than the Yellow River. The Yellow, this is not the world's best map, but the Yellow has that kind of nasty curve up in the north, and when you see a river that has a course like that, you can kind of tell that flooding is going to be an issue. It's not that the Yangtze never floods, but it doesn't flood as unpredictably and catastrophically as the Yellow. The big thing that had kept previous empires from integrating the two was disease, and malaria in particular. Cast your mind back to the Zhou Empire, way back centuries before the Common Era. They managed to get control over the Yangtze Valley, but disease was a problem. Anytime you come from a relatively northern region and go and try to populate and colonize a relatively southern region, disease is going to be an issue, probably, because the warmer, wetter regions tend to have a much larger pool of bacteria. And if you grow up in a northern climate and don't have natural immunity, you're going to get sick and possibly die. Somehow the Tang managed to overcome this barrier. In the absence of quinine or any other way to treat malaria with modern day drugs, somehow they did it. We still don't quite know how. One thing that their predecessors, the Sway Dynasty, Yong, he wasn't all bad. One thing he did that has lasted up to this day was to build a canal between the two rivers, which made shipping so much more easier. That's the Grand Canal with the gigantic red arrow, since the map is so bad, pointing to it. And this meant you could ship from one region to another and then ship out to the coast, ship towards Central Asia. It made resource circulation and circulation of crafted goods within the empire that much easier. And it's still in use today. These are modern shots. Houseboats, even on the Grand Canal, are still a phenomenon. I especially like the picture of the modern skyscrapers in the background with the houseboats in the foreground. Okay, so economically, the Tang are really going great guns. They've got an empire that's very focused on trade, they've got the commercial infrastructure, they've got the centralized government. What about ideologically? Well, it's under the Tang that Mahayana Buddhism really becomes entrenched. By the time they come to power, Buddhism has been in China for several centuries. It's, in Judge Dee's opinion, a foreign import, but it's been Sinified or Chineseified, if you like. And the early Tang rulers are Buddhists. They patronize Buddhism. They give money to have Buddhist monasteries built and to have translations of the scriptures done and this kind of thing. But at the same time, they're also staunch Confucianists. So in the case of these early rulers, they coexist very nicely. They don't just coexist, they actually mesh. You've got your spiritual element with Buddhism, and then the ethical system, and above all, the training for the imperial bureaucracy with Confucianism. However, the early Tang rulers are known for being really serious Buddhists. Not only do they endow monasteries, they hold official Buddhist ceremonies at their court. One of the most famous or infamous Tang emperors, and she was at the height of her powers an actual emperor, not an empress, Empress Wu, about whom I will have more to say, actually kind of tries to use Buddhism as a means of leveraging her own power. She actually claims to be a bodhisattva, one of those enlightened people who forego nirvana or postpone it in order to help others achieve it. And you know, if you're the emperor, or even the empress, and you're a bodhisattva, that makes you very authoritative indeed. What she was trying to do was just to use it to reinforce her own power. She tried to make it a state religion. So we see the potential for it to come into friction with Confucianism. It doesn't displace Confucianism under her rule, but it really becomes the ideology. And what this means is she's giving a lot of land to monks and nuns, monks mainly, to build monasteries, and the land that they own is not taxed. So you have this kind of powerful Buddhist clique. When Judge Dee refers rather snarkily to a clique in the capital, he's probably talking about this Buddhist clique around Empress Wu. She is ruling during his lifetime. Her most famous architectural commission is at, it's just outside Luoyang, the old Eastern Han capital, which the Tang also used as a kind of summer capital, at a place called Longmen. And these are actually my own photographs. I went to Luoyang specifically to see these grottos. It's a series of caves, man-made caves on two banks of this little tributary of the Yellow River. And these are caves in which statues of the Buddha, the Bodhisattvas, various guardian figures, etc., were carved by different dynasties, or the craftsmen of different dynasties, over about a 300 or 400 year period. So starting during that chaotic period before the Tang, and then reaching their height with the Tang. This is by far the most famous set of statues. You have to imagine, it's all along this riverbank. So here's the Buddha. This is the Fengjian cave. And there's some legend that the face of this Buddha was actually based on Empress Wu herself. I mean, yeah, don't they look alike? Yeah, that's probably just an urban legend. And then you have bodhisattvas on the side, a monk, and this guardian figure. And you can see this woman taking a picture in front of the Buddha, how big these things are. And then you pull back, stairs coming up from the river, and in this shot they are right over here. So you've got different caves with their own Buddhas inside all along both banks. It's really quite stunning. The problem with this kind of patronage of Buddhism really has to do less with carving Buddhas like this and more with the monasteries. Because as in medieval Europe, Western Europe, as you'll see in a few weeks, when the monasteries, when these lands are given over to religious orders, the government cannot tax them. So they lose revenues, they lose cultivable land, or at least land that could be cultivated by non-monk types. And any economic crisis, that's going to be that much revenue or that less revenue that they don't have. So the later Tang rulers who do face this kind of crisis blame the Buddhists for it. You know, they're thinking, if only we hadn't given them this land for the monasteries. You know, if only that horrible Empress Wu had not given them all this land, we'd be so much better off. And so they use it as a kind of excuse to persecute Buddhists who, incidentally, they suddenly discover are practitioners of a foreign import religion, and to promote Confucianism. So in the late Tang period, so far from meshing well, Buddhism and Confucianism are kind of pitted against each other, even though one is a religion and one is an ethical system. One reason that Empress Wu might have found Buddhism attractive is that compared to Confucianism, Buddhism, all other things being equal, gives women a certain degree of space to participate. Confucianism is a male-dominated system. You know, there's a hierarchy of age, wisdom, and gender. So within the family, which is like a microcosm of society, the wife is subservient to the husband, the mother is subservient to the father. The children and parents pay respect to the grandparents who are much older and wiser. That's supposed to be an analogy for the state, where the wise elderly bureaucrats and scholars receive the most respect because they're so wise, they've been around, they've seen it all, and the ruler can use them as sources of advice. In that scheme of things, an empress might be a little bit hard to picture. And that may have been one reason that Empress Wu tried to make Buddhism the state religion and actually claimed to be a bodhisattva herself. Okay, so let's focus a little bit on Empress Wu as an example, maybe the most famous in Imperial Chinese history, except for right at the very end, of a powerful woman. Her actual personal name was Wu Jiao. We'll start with her there. She originates, and she has very humble origins. She's the emperor's concubine. And I know I keep asking this, but what do we mean by a concubine?
Someone that the emperor is not married to, a sexual partner.
A sexual partner, but not a wife. No legal bond. But she's in the palace, so she's not just somebody from the street or anything. So she starts out as a kind of low-ranking concubine, and then she claws her way up the hierarchy of concubines. She actually displaces the emperor's favorite concubine, and then she even displaces his wife. She allegedly has them tortured and killed. Now, footnote here, because later very pro-Confucian Tong bureaucrats hated Empress Wu, she was like the person they loved to hate, they elaborated on these stories about her and promoted their spread. So there are all these horror stories about what a tyrant she was and the horrible things she had done to her enemies, which should be taken with a large grain of salt. However, having said that, I will actually read you the kind of thing that was said. So it was the Gaozong emperor whose concubine she was, and in 655, when she was only about 30 years old, she has the emperor's wife, deposed and sent to prison along with this former concubine. So the story goes, when she heard that the emperor had visited his former empress in her prison quarters, which also housed this former concubine whom Empress Wu hated, she had both women beaten with 100 strokes of the cane, their limbs cut off, and their remains thrown into a wine vat. The wine vat is key here. It's like, what kind of sicko would do that? Soon thereafter, the emperor's health began to decline. Well, one problem with this story is chronological, because this was 655, the emperor died 28 years later. So it's a very long, slow decline to his health. Empress Wu herself, when she displaced his empress, she became empress. But then, when the emperor finally died, one of her sons became emperor, and this is going to have a very familiar ring to those of you who do Ottoman history. Every mother of a prince wanted that prince to take the throne, and in this case it happened. But she decided her son was not very competent, so she eventually deposed him. Then another son took the throne, another one of her sons took the throne. She decided he was incompetent, so she deposed him and took the throne herself, and that's when she actually named herself emperor. Not just empress, but emperor. And in that capacity, she took the regnal title Wu Zhe Tian, which means rule of the sky, to indicate that she is really the world emperor here. And she named her last son as her heir apparent. Now this last son, I guess you could say, got the last laugh because he eventually deposed her and succeeded her. Now by this time, she was in her 80s, and one of the reasons he deposed her was that she was supposedly getting rather senile. So if she's that horrible and actually dismembered her enemies and threw them into wine vats while they were still alive, why did she live to reign such a long time? The thinking is that the stories are not really true. Meanwhile, her son, who succeeded her, irony of ironies, was supposedly poisoned by his own wife, who of course was chosen for him by his mother, Empress Wu. So it really does have this kind of soap opera-ish feel. As a figure in popular culture, though, Empress Wu has great staying power. She's kind of a role model of a certain kind. a positive role model for Chinese children, or at least she used to be when this video came out. It's kind of like the Disney version of Empress Wu as strong, Oprah-like woman. And then I thought this was interesting. There is actually a Vietnamese video. It shows how widespread her influence was. That's not for children, it's more the soap opera type. And this is the Vietnamese version of her name, Wu Zê Tien. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Vietnamese. So rather than thinking of her as this horrible autocrat, brutal, twisted, cuts up people she doesn't like and throws them into a vat of wine, it would be more realistic, especially given how long she reigned and how old she was when she died, to think of her as something like the Queen of England. And similar taste in headgear, too. Yes, don't just collapse laughing at her. The other big Tang Dynasty example of a powerful woman who came to a much less savory end was a concubine who never became empress, Yang Guifei. Yang Guifei simply means the concubine Yong, her family name. So she's about a century after, she's born about 14 years after Empress Wu dies, so is active 50 to 75 years later. The emperor at the time is absolutely, hopelessly in love with her and will do anything she wants, and so this is kind of what gives her leverage. She is able to get members of her family, because she is from China itself, she does not come in from some other region, appointed to high government positions. So her family more or less takes over the court. And the emperor is so devoted to her that he builds a palace for her outside Chang'an. This is the core of what today is called the Huaqing Palace Cultural Complex, which contains a much later statue of Yang Guifei. It used to be in the middle of the lake. Now it's just standing out on the paving stones. And she's supposed to be getting ready to go into one of these bathing pools that the emperor built specially for her and which had been excavated. Now she looks like a full-figured, healthy woman, and there is actually some urban legend that she was really obese, but she wasn't obese, she was just what was popular at the time in many civilizations. Full-figured, kind of plump, to show that, she's wealthy and prosperous, so she's not thin and starving looking. And if you're wondering about this much later Mongol era picture of her getting on a horse, it's kind of hard to see if she's on the other side being helped onto the horse with the help of a step ladder, and it's not because she was so large, like they had to push her up. That's how royal people mounted horses in general. Even the emperor himself would have used a step ladder. Now I wanted to attempt, and I don't know if this will be possible, this is the kind of thing that's put on at this Huaqing cultural complex today. These Tang Dynasty inspired dances performed by dance students. And let's see if I can get it to play. I think I might have to. Okay, well, it's not going to work apparently, so I won't even. Let's just leave well enough alone. Anyway, spoiled my surprise, but this is me trying to, well, you can't see me in the picture, but I'm trying to videotape this dance from the back of a crowd of tourists. The dancer with the large pink headdress is supposed to represent Yang Guifei herself. It's part of modern China's sort of glorification of the Tang period as a very prosperous one. Okay, well, with Empress Wu and with Yang Guifei, you have two powerful women, and with Yang in particular, I don't think oh yes, okay. I knew there was something I should have mentioned here. I mentioned that she came to a less than savory end. One of her favorites who got appointed to high office was this court jester, believe it or not, known as An Lushan. She got him appointed to be military commander of a large northeastern region of the Tang Empire. And he was in this position when he rebelled. he somehow, for whatever reason, launched this enormous rebellion against the central government, never mind that they had given him this position, which lasted, as you can see there, for 8 years. And was very hard for the Tang to put down, and really weakened the central government. So the emperor's other military officers blamed Yang Guifei for this rebellion. After all, this fellow was her favorite, and look what he did. So in the course of putting down the rebellion, they executed her. Many, many people were killed in the course of the imperial troops putting down this rebellion. And you can imagine after something like that, you know, people are going to draw conclusions like, well, this is what happens when you let a woman become so powerful. You see it ever since Empress Wu, it's just been downhill. So there was a Confucian backlash, not caused entirely by these two women, but as part of a general trajectory. There's a bit of a financial crisis going into the 9th century. In part, one factor in that was all the land taken out of taxation by the Buddhist monasteries. And with Empress Wu, with Yang Guifei, with economic crisis and warfare and the lack of tax revenues, you see a gradual turning against Buddhism and a shoring up of Confucianism. So at this point, they're no longer interacting peacefully. They are kind of at loggerheads with each other. So the later Tang rulers, from about the early 9th century, start really becoming hostile toward Buddhism. This is the kind of attitude that you see Judge Dee rather anachronistically expressing in Van Gulik's novels. It's this foreign import, doesn't really have any business in Chinese society. So, and the monks are just freeloaders, they're taking our tax revenues. So the later Tang rulers actually destroyed a bunch of monasteries, something like 146,000 monasteries, and confiscated their land so that they could redistribute it to peasants and tax it. On the other hand, the Tang government had never stopped patronizing Confucianism, and it continued to. It redoubled its efforts to patronize it beginning in the 9th century. This is the period when you really see the bureaucrats as a very, very strong element in society. The scholar gentry, these Confucian scholars who come out of this gentry class, the large landowning class. And they rise to the bureaucracy by taking these competitive empire-wide exams. The exam system really becomes entrenched under the Tang. We saw the roots of it under the Han, who opened an academy for teaching Confucian classics. The Han don't actually have an exam system. By this period in the Tang Dynasty, there is an exam system. So, to put it in some kind of context, imagine if your grade in this class, if for your grade in this class, you had to memorize the bullet book, and then you'd come to my office at some set date, and you'd be locked in there for several days, and you'd have to sit down and write out the bullet book from memory while making appropriate commentary in a very ritualized essay. And by the way, neatness counts. You'd be using a reed pen dipped in ink, and your calligraphy would also be graded. And your entire grade would depend on that. That's pretty much what these exams were like. And Judge Dee would have become a judge because of his rank on this empire-wide exam. Technically, anyone in the empire, who was male anyway, could take this exam. So you could be a peasant. If you managed to memorize enough Confucian classics and learn how to write one of these essays, you could go take the exam at your provincial center. And then if you made the lightning round, if you made the cut, you'd go to the Imperial Capital. This is a latter-day museum reproduction of the kind of cell, aptly named, that the exam candidates stayed in. So you have your humble bed for the rare moments when you sleep on one side, and then your desk with your little tea basket. Judge Dee always has a tea basket handy, your ink pad, your reed pen, and a lone candle in the niche. And you would sit there and write and write and write over days. As Van Gulik points out, men in the Tang Dynasty did not wear long pigtails, but later on, under the Qing Dynasty, they did. And there's some story, again probably an urban legend, about an exam candidate with one of these long pigtails, and he desperately wanted to avoid falling asleep so he could keep studying and writing. So he saw a hook in the ceiling, and so the story goes, he tied the end of his braid to the hook, and every time he was about to slump over the desk of sweep, he'd be jerked upright so he could, you should try it sometime. In the Chinese maids murders, there are a couple of characters who are candidates for this exam. The painter guy is a candidate, and the son of Commander Ding is a candidate. So they're presumably people who are studying, preparing to take this exam, the first round of this exam in this little provincial town where it's set, with the hope of later going to the Imperial Capital. But what this was supposed to do, and it succeeded to a large degree, was create an absolute meritocracy. Like, no matter what kind of background you came from, rural, urban, rich, poor, you'd be rewarded with a position in the bureaucracy according to your merit. And the better you did, the higher up in the bureaucracy you would go. And you could also rise through the bureaucracy once you've been appointed. In actual fact, as we've already seen under the Han, the landowning families tended to have an advantage because they were wealthy. They could afford to acquire scrolls of Confucian classics for their sons to study, and of course the sons themselves were literate, and they had some time on their hands because they weren't the ones out there plowing the field. The peasants were doing that. But there was always the chance that someone from a very, very humble background would be able to make it in this system. And it worked for Imperial China right up until the end of Imperial rule in 1911. So it definitely had staying power. By the way, this is a reenactment of one of these exams in South Korea, which was also, as you'll see Thursday, was heavily influenced by Tong Confucianism. And so they're not in cells, they're out in public. I didn't mention that you had to wear your best clothes when you were doing that as well. So you dress up, you use perfect calligraphy, and you write the bullet book, start to finish, with commentary in beautiful calligraphy. The great thing about this bureaucracy, and we've seen this going all the way back to the Zhou Dynasty, the bureaucracy is the backbone. It provides stability in a time of political crisis. When the central government collapses, the bureaucracy is still there. They might be employed by succeeding states, but they, at least in theory, provide a degree of stability to this society that many other empires, including the Romans, don't really have. They do have bureaucracies, but not like this. So when all else fails, the exam-driven bureaucracy is still there. Okay, last slide. How do the Tang come to an end? Well, it's kind of the same pattern we've seen. The central government weakens, and we've already seen some of the rebellions on Lushan. There are outside forces like the Uyghurs, like other states up in the north, who take advantage to invade the border regions. And it's this typical pattern that you see over and over from the Zhou Dynasty all the way, certainly up to the Tang. Regional warlords take advantage of the central weakening to kind of carve out niches for themselves. But it's less likely to be an invasion of regional warlords that actually puts an end to the dynasty, and more likely to be some kind of coup. There is a major rebellion late in the 9th century that you could say terminally weakens the Tang. That's the Huangchao Rebellion, and this will strike you as ironic, I hope. It's led by a frustrated exam candidate. I couldn't get the job I wanted, so I'm going to try and overthrow the whole system. That's what they get for denying me my judgeship. It lasts for 2 years, so not quite as catastrophic as the An Lushan Rebellion. And he is from the gentry class, by the way, the same class that tended to dominate the exams and the bureaucracy. It doesn't work for him, he rebels. The thinking is that fatally weakened the Tang. They limp along for a couple of more decades, and then finally the more recent pattern repeats itself. A warlord who's linked to the central government puts an end to the line. And eventually there's a short period of chaos, and eventually the Song Dynasty, which you'll hear about on Thursday, arises. What you see at the bottom is my own photographs of kind of modern-day Chinese appropriation, I guess we can say, of the prosperous Tang image. This is in Jian itself, near the old Tang capital of Chang'an, and that's what in English this dynasty is called, the Prosperous Tang Dynasty. So this is a shot from the walls. Xi'an is one of the few Chinese cities to retain its medieval walls, and you can walk around them. I took an embarrassingly long time to do that. But so you're looking off the wall, there's this road, and there you have the almost stereotypical double-humped Tang Dynasty camels, and one of these, the population is known as the Hu. The Hu semi-nomadic people who are instrumental in the camel trade. This is from the Western market, another iconic image of Tong musicians, or maybe they're actually from somewhere else, like Hu, like even Iranian, on top of the camel. And then, this is right at the beginning of the wall walk, you can attend the Tang Dynasty-esque extravaganza that's advertised on the billboard, and if you can't make it, you can always stick your face in these Tang Dynasty cutouts. So it's really just very interesting. This dynasty is regarded extremely positively. And you can kind of see why. Very extensive, heavily promoting trade, intellectually creative, a few ideological and military blips along the way, but on the whole, one of Imperial China's bigger success stories. So we'll leave it there.